Let's come back to the carb piece. You brought this up as one of the two big principles that you've shifted in. You talked about being down in Costa Rica, and obviously a higher carb diet would be more conducive down there. But talk about the full spectrum here. Even back at home now, it sounds like you're having higher carb than you would have a couple years ago. So basically, go through the whole carb scenario when you're in different areas, how you look at them differently, and how much you're consuming on a regular basis.
I was definitely part of this faction a couple of years ago around keto diet, and I think that I have a theory that I've started to piece together. There's some disparate science on this that basically lay it all out. I think that eating an ultra processed food diet, especially full of seed oils for a long period of time, really can mess up physiology. And it basically changes the mitochondria in a way that you cannot effectively use carbohydrates. That is then confused with carbs are bad inherently. And you've seen this phenomenon now over the last 10 years, like starting even with paleo was kind of like low-ish carb to get like maybe 75 to 100 grams of carbs a day. It was like most of the recommendations on that. I think people generally felt way better on that. And then a lot of people who are interested in health went into keto and felt amazing. And then now people are coming out of that and getting really into things like Ray Peat's work and just really maxing out carbohydrates. And I have this working theory that once going through and removing things like seed oils, eating very low carb, and basically getting the metabolic machinery back online, your body can start tolerating and handling carbs in a more appropriate way. And that may be different for different people. And so the way I liken this is sort of like if I were going outside on a walk and I trip over a curb and I sprain my ankle, that ankle's going to be a little sore for a couple of weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, but it'll be totally fine. If I fall off that curb and break my ankle, maybe it's a couple months. If I get run over by a bus and my foot is completely mangled, well, I may never walk appropriately again. And so some people on a metabolic level might also have that case where like they may never be able to process carbs internally in a proper way. And so there's like an internal damage that can be done that sometimes can be reversed, sometimes can be back to 80%. And sometimes people like will just do better indefinitely on a low carb ketogenic diet. There's for sure those instances. I've seen that clinically. Absolutely. We're like, there's no way that people are going to add in 400, 500 grams of carbs a day. Paul's eating like way more than that, which is insane. He's like the most insane ectomorphic person I've ever met. But there's just like different tolerance to different people. And I thought for a while I had a specific intolerance to carbohydrates. And it wasn't until I got really strict about eliminating seed oils for, it takes years to get them out of your system. And even still, it's like your body holds on to them to get integrated into cell membranes. And so doing a very low linoleic acid diet and going sort of like in a keto low carb seems to have worked really well for me to be able to tolerate carbs again. And it took me a while to reintroduce them and start adding them up. And now I'm at a point where I can eat a lot of them and feel really good and not have these blood sugar crashes and a lot of metabolic dysregulation that I had before eating a lot of carbohydrates, which I think like then has spun in this new thing where I think blood glucose monitors are great for certain things and getting feedback, but I don't believe that blood sugar high equals bad. As long as you have good utilization of that blood sugar and you have good glucose disposal, I don't think there's an increase in blood sugar is inherently bad for the human body.
Okay, for me, there's three different pieces there. The latter, what you just stated, the fact that we have to reevaluate whether the spikes are actually bad, the seed oil piece and how that affects the mitochondria. And then the third one is you mentioned Paul and how his body can just handle more carbs based on genetics. So let's zoom in on the second piece, the seed oil piece. You mentioned there how they can stay in the body and cell membranes for a long period of time. First of all, let's do a 101 on what we're talking about here. And then is there a way to speed up that process to get rid of them?
Just about seed oils in general?
Yeah, let's go deep into that part and then we can move from there.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm sure your listeners have heard about what seed oils are in the past, but they're typically large monocrop seeds, hence the seed oil, that are pressed and then typically refined using a bunch of different chemicals and manufacturing processes to make fat and liquid oils. So a long history in this. So no need to bore people with 2 hours of a history lesson, but we started consuming these. 1911 was one of the first ones with Crisco, and now it's about 25% of the American diet. Why these are so bad is there's a bunch of different things around processing and people talking about things like hexane and other chemicals that are added to that. What seems to be the issue is that they are upwards of 85+% of linoleic acid, which is a polyunsaturated fatty acid that's highly reactive to oxygen. So it oxidizes very easily and is very unstable in the body. Most foods in nature are about 2 to 3%. And so we're eating foods that are now 25% of our diet, foods that are 80+% of this certain fatty acid. It's never really been the case before. There are some foods that are high in nature, like nuts and seeds, obviously, because of seed oils, but they only show up right before winter in northern latitudes. And so if you think about the mechanism of what's going on here and how it can create a transient insulin resistance and potentially get some fat gain and get some, they've been shown to be very obesogenic. This makes sense from an environmental perspective if you're trying to put on fat before the winter. So again, the environment provides, nature provides for us, makes a lot of sense. When we eat this stuff every day, ongoing, and a long period of time, these fatty acids then get integrated into all of our cell membranes. And so all of our nervous tissue, and then even the mitochondrial membrane, linoleic acid starts integrating where there used to be other more stable fatty acids, and then those can auto-oxidize and basically break the literal membrane of the mitochondria. And then this can create a cascade down the mitochondria, which effectively renders the whole electron transport chain not unusable, but it's like very inefficient. And so Stefan Guyenet did a really great study on this, looking at linoleic acid in human tissue over time, and it is just skyrocketing. And so with monogastric animals, pork, chicken, these things as well, the more you eat of these things on a constant basis, the more they accumulate in your body. So when you're eating things like glucose, for example, or even like pure white sugar, your blood glucose goes up, your body disposes of it. If you eat things like processed refined grains and you get maybe some gluten and things like that some people can't tolerate, you can have issues with the gut lining, which breaks the gap junctions and creates some dysbiosis, but that can be fixed in, if you stop eating it 1, 2, 3 weeks. When you eat something like a seed oil and you have high amounts of this linoleic acid on an ongoing basis, they can be in your tissues for 2 to 4 years. And so they bioaccumulate, they go up and up and up and up. And then it leads you to a point where it's really hard. Some people feel good when they remove them immediately, but sometimes it may take literally couples of years to reduce consumption to get back to any sort of baseline, to get changeover in the actual fatty acids in your body.
And when we look at the problem with linoleic acid, we started out talking about the seed oils and then pivoted down to linoleic acid. You mentioned the fact that it's found in other foods as well, pork, chicken, even olive oil. How much of the problem is linoleic acid specifically? And then how much of it is these oils and damage that's done to them with the processing, and how much of a processed food those are?
Again, it's not necessarily that linoleic acid itself is toxic and going to kill you. Again, in most, even in tallow, like for example, most tallows are like 2 to 3% linoleic acid. So our bodies can process it. It's just the amount. So we are eating an amount that is not appropriate for our physiology. And that is causing an imbalance. Just like you can drink too much water and cause hyponatremia and die. Anything in an excess can kill you effectively and be, quote unquote, toxic to the body. And so it's the amount. And then also there are toxic aldehydes that form from heating them and from storing them. And so basically when they're in a bottle, especially if they're stored in plastic bottles, UV hits them, they're processed in a way, then we bleach them and deodorize them because they would smell like literally like rancid fish. This is the smell of rancid. The smell of rancid fish is the omega-3 getting rancid. And so seed oils, if we didn't deodorize them, they would smell the exact same thing. So we have these built-in mechanisms for our body to know when a fat has gone rancid. And we take that away when we process these oils through a deodorization process. Not ideal, obviously. And so we would typically be able to smell that and know, like, oh, this is a rotten food. I should not be eating this. We remove that, and then we're eating them constantly. And you know, the absolute worst thing you possibly do is put these things in a deep fryer, heat them over and over and over and over again, which skyrockets the oxidation of them and creates these downstream metabolites like 4-HNE, 9-HOD, 13-HOD that have entire journal issues dedicated to them as far as studying the downstream effects on metabolic issues, fat gain, diabetes, heart disease, on and on and on. The mechanisms are very clear. And those things effectively only come in our diet via seed oils and via linoleic acid. So they're from linoleic acid breaking down with heat and oxygen leads to these compounds, which lead to this massive disarray. And like this mechanism is like very clearly known. And this is why I don't understand the pro seed oil people. They claim that, you know, there's not a lot of great human RCT data, that when you remove seed oils, things change. And there's arguments, you know, every side has their own argument to that. But the mechanistic example here is like very clear in my mind. And so, yeah, it's to bring it back to like why I think this damage that can be done to the body, and then the time it takes, and going low carb and doing some of these things and eradicating the seed oils and going low linoleic acid. And a lot of people seem to restore a lot of the mitochondrial function for them to be able to tolerate more of the glucose into the body and increase carbs again, which is like really fascinating to me.
How does the low carb piece fit into getting these out of the body? I'm assuming you'd have to cut the oils out, but is there a mechanism there when you're low carb that is helping expel them quicker?
I think it's less about expelling them quicker and more about the body's inability, as the mitochondria is effectively broken via this. So when you're looking at the transport chain, electron transport chain, and the linoleic acid that's embedded in there starts breaking down and oxidizing, it will really affect this thing called cardiolipin, which are they're these little proteins that are in the mitochondrial membrane. Those start breaking, and then they start auto-oxidizing. And this does not allow you to metabolize carbohydrates very well, because you need that system to be working to shuttle electrons through the transport chain. And so going low carb allows you to simultaneously start changing over the fatty acids in the mitochondria while not overburdening the system with tons of demand to be working well. And then it just gives you a chance to eat more fat, saturated fats, things like stearic acid, especially these long chain fatty acids that can help replace these linoleic acid fatty acids in your membranes. And then there's other things you can do, like phosphatidylcholine can help push through and change over cell membranes faster. Vitamin E can help with the oxidation of this. There's like, I've been thinking through a while, like, is there a protocol that would make sense to help speed this up? And could we test on it? And something I do, like, I was about to launch a company a couple of years ago around like testing for how much linoleic acid is in the body, coming up with different protocols, and then figuring out like what can we do to help speed this process up to help restore people's metabolic function. And so, I mean, I have some note document that's like 3 years old with a bunch of theories in it. I never tested it, but yeah, there's a lot of proposed mechanisms I think could be really interesting to test. But I don't have any like concrete, like, do X, Y, or Z if you really want to get through this whole phase. I think the biggest thing is just reducing the amount of ultra processed seed oils is like the biggest thing. And then pork and chicken is another thing that even anecdotally, and seeing people switch to keto, switch to carnivore diets, and having a high amount of bacon, chicken, pork, things like that, with, again, still very high amounts of linoleic acid, because these monogastric animals, just like humans, are eating lots of corn and soy, even the pasture-raised ones. So there's no commercially available pigs or chickens that eat a species-appropriate diet. And so they're all fed corn and soy. Again, I'll repeat, even the best quality pasture-raised, quote unquote pasture-raised, regenerative, there's no such thing as a regenerative pig or chicken commercially available for consumption. And I don't think people understand that. Like we're kind of told like there's this upper echelon of meat, and it's because grazing animals can eat, like, so cows can eat corn and soy, and they have a very complex digestive system where they can break down all the fatty acids into 2-carbon chains and build them back up into saturated fat in their tissue. So even if cattle are eating corn and soy, their linoleic acid at the end of the day will still be 2 or 3% like it would be if they're eating grass. There's a lot of other reasons why you want a grass-fed cow over a grain-fed one, but from a fatty acid perspective, it's about the same. When you're looking at pigs and chickens, even the best pasture-raised ones will have linoleic acid amounts 2 times higher than canola oil. So 35, 40, 45%. And I've gotten lab tests done of like the best possible ones. There are small local farms in a bunch of different areas. Like there's one here called Casad Family Farms that does all local feed mixes and feeds their pigs a very low linoleic acid diet. And I've tested their stuff and it's like low single digit. But anything that you're going to get at a store, anything you're going to be able to get like commercially available, it all has to be fed corn and soy. So like even reducing sometimes for people, they even need to take out egg yolks because most eggs are also raised from chickens that are fed corn and soy. So it gets a little complicated, but I think that, like, again, just the biggest step is just removing it from your diet. For literally, it takes a couple years to get this stuff out of your cells. And some tissues that have low blood perfusion, like joint surfaces, things like that, it could take up to 15 years to get these seed oils out of your cells, which is insane. And so the biggest thing, again, just removing them and going lower amount.
Is there a test where you can see how much of it is accumulated in your body? I know for omega-3s, you can do a test and you can get a number. Anything like that in this realm?
There's an OmegaQuant test that fractionates the red blood cell. So it's not, I mean, the best thing to do would be able to biopsy your fat. But so I don't even know if that exists. I think that you can do it in a lab, but it's not like a consumer test that you can just do. So an OmegaQuant test can give you like a little bit of a proxy to it. It's not perfect, but it's good. And you track this over time and just see like, is this working? Yes or no? And so that's the best one. I think it's like a couple $100. But at the end of the day, it's like, I don't even know if there's like a end goal. I think people get a little bit obsessed with lab numbers and try to like really focus on like, it must be this amount for me to feel X, Y, or Z thing. I think that one of the things to test out is, can you handle carbohydrates? And how do you feel? Like, are you getting a crazy crash after eating carbohydrates? And we're talking about like real whole food carbohydrates as well. I know there's like with the repeat movement, there's a lot of people that are just like chugging Coca-Cola and white sugar, and hopefully they have great outcomes. There's, I think that there's a lot of different things in food that help digest the carbohydrates when you're eating real food with the whole food matrix involved. But I think that's one of the tests of like, first, how do you look, feel, perform? And then second, like, can you tolerate carbohydrates? Is a big one of like, are your linoleic acid numbers under control? Instead of being obsessed about a lab test. But if you want to go that route, feel free, do it. The OmegaQuant exists.
That's the test I was talking about for omega-3s.
Yeah. So they have a omega-6 levels and linoleic acid in that test as well. I think there's like 2 different versions of it. One is just omega-3 or omega-3-6 ratio. And then one is a little bit more advanced, one that has all the different fatty acids in relativity to each other.
Okay, given what you said about the monogastric animals, unless we know the farmer, it sounds like we should either really moderate those or avoid them, especially in this healing phase when we're trying to clean up the body of linoleic acid. Are those part of your diet? You mentioned there's a local farm where you can get better stuff. Why don't at this point you just give us an overview of what your diet looks like?
Yeah, I try to hunt as much as possible. And then if I can't get any hunted meat, then I'm actually going to that same farm, Casad, and I feel I have a huge chest freezer from that. And then I'm on a board of a local nonprofit here called Locavore, which just sources from farms that are in like a 250-mile radius. And so like I would say 90% of my food comes from that. And I eat pork occasionally. I also just like, I've gotten to the point where I just crave, people call it the gaminess of meat. And I think that is more relative to the actual nutrient density and minerals found in meat, of like a hunted elk, for example, versus a grain-fed steak. They taste very different. And a lot of people don't have the taste for that because they've been conditioned to have effectively flavorless meat that just tastes fatty. And so I now crave that, minerality in the meat way more than I do. And I just like don't get that same satisfaction when I have pork. But I do eat pork from I don't know, maybe like a couple times a month. But I'll buy a quarter of a pig from that farm that's north of here. And they do a great job. I get fish from Seatopia, which is a place that does regenerative aquaculture. I don't know if you've come across them at all, but they're absolutely incredible. So basically, like,
I've heard of them.
yeah, what is kind of blew my mind when I first heard about them. But what we do with ruminant animals on land, move them around, bring them into species appropriate behavior, which is rotating them as if predators were chasing them around, which has an impact on the land that starts building up soil fertility, and the land responds to them appropriately. I've always had this negative connotation in farmed fish, but love regenerative farmed beef and have no sort of negative connotation there, which is kind of weird. But you can actually do the same process in water as well to restore our oceans and our seas. And so they're doing regenerative aquaculture, which is putting fish in a species appropriate way, you're feeding them a species appropriate diet, which actually then brings back kelp for us, brings back mussels and oysters and other things like that. And then they test for heavy metals, microplastics, contaminants, et cetera. And it's all basically to zero, which like wild fish is very challenging to get. That isn't now because we've polluted our ocean so much. It's very challenging to get any fish that's clean, even if it's like you go out in the middle of nowhere and fish for fish. And so they've done a tremendous job. And so I'll eat tons of fish from them. You can eat it raw. Like I make poke bowls from it. It's incredible. And like I said, rice, tubers in this time. And I'll eat a lot of that. I'm trying to think about what I had today. A lot of raw milk. There's an incredible raw dairy here. So I have a lot of raw dairy. Honey is a carbohydrate that I eat. I think that, again, like I'm not going out and foraging for all my food, but there are foods like white rice, foods like honey that I can keep them out in my pantry, and they are easily preserved without adding a lot of weird chemicals. And we humans have had a way of preserving food for a very long period of time via fermentation and a lot of other processes as well. And then there's foods that are just naturally preserved throughout seasons. Honey, a lot of grains. I don't typically eat a lot of grains that aren't like white rice is great because you can remove the phytates and the lectins from the actual bran of the rice. There's a reason why we've been doing it for thousands of years. And so I'll eat those as my carbohydrate sources, mostly in the wintertime, and then different root vegetables. Trying to think of like really anything else. I'll have some frozen berries. Supplementation wise, I have, obviously I'm biased because I sell the products, but I have beef protein and I think it's the best for a variety of reasons. So I'll have a decent amount of that, especially like as busy as I am. Like I do not want people to ever be thinking about meal replacements, but supplementation and like keeping protein amount high. To be able to like cook meat several times a day and eat it is just kind of a pain in the ass sometimes. And so for me, like getting in a smoothie whenever I can with like raw milk, honey, raw egg yolks, protein powder, even frozen berries is a game changer. And that'll be at least one of my meals in a day. But yeah, I mean, just trying to get, like I said, as much local. I'm trying to think if there's any really stuff that I even get at like a Whole Foods or anything here. I think, sometimes we have meals and we have occasional better for you type of stuff, like maybe siete tortillas or something like that, but it's not a large part of my nutrition.
So let's come back to seed oils. We've talked about a lot of different points here. The basic being remove them from the diet. We got to be careful of certain animals high in linoleic acid, depending on what they're eating. We talked about testing. We talked about the period of time it takes to clear those from the body. So it sounded like to me why the low carb or ketogenic diet could be beneficial to somebody that's incorporated a lot of those into their body is a lot like somebody who's insulin resistant and they can't process glucose in the brain, ketones being another source of energy. You touched on that, but is that a piece of this? The fact that when we've broken our mitochondria with these seed oils and we can't process with our metabolism carbs the same, are the ketones coming in and acting like an alternative fuel for the cells of the body?
Yeah, I mean, that is something the ketones can do for sure. They cross the blood-brain barrier. You can use them in different ways. They also act as a signaling molecule. So I think that ketones are fascinating, and I think they could be great supplementally. I think the ketogenic diet is a phenomenal tool, especially for things like Alzheimer and dementia, especially in these late-term things like you're talking about, this glucose, inability to use glucose in the brain. I think that the difference in where I've changed my thoughts and opinions over the last, call it 7 years, is that the insulin resistant nature is from the carbohydrates in the first place. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think the insulin resistance actually comes from the linoleic acid and a bunch of other, typical Western lifestyle things that kind of add on to that. But it seems like that's the smoking gun, and it's not the carbohydrates initially that caused the inability to use carbohydrates, which is, I think, still the predominant narrative around what's going on, which then demonizes carbohydrates in totality. And then that goes back to the individual nature of, does somebody who is 7 years old and going through dementia, has Alzheimer's, or gets cancer later in life, which ketone, like glucose, feeds a lot of cancer cells, and ketogenic therapy has been shown to be remarkable for a lot of different cancers, glioblastoma especially, like a lot of the ones in the brain. Is it worth it for them to go on a seed oil depleted diet and try to change over and try to get, no. Like we're at a different stage here. And this is why the individuality of it is like very important to think through, like, what is the best use case of this? And like I made the example before, like maybe their metabolic machinery is just at a certain point where, like, you shouldn't be focusing based upon their goals, where they're at and where they need to be. You shouldn't be focusing on reintroducing carbohydrates. Just like understand that there's metabolic dysfunction going on. And the best way to get around that for sure in a short-term fashion is with a ketogenic diet using ketones.
Got it. So it sounds like you're clarifying what I was getting at there. I was trying to make the analogy in the brain using ketones when we're insulin resistant. And you're saying that in the cells of the body, when they are broken, the mitochondria, because of seed oils, they can use ketones to run during that period of time that we're repairing.
Correct. Yep.
And is the ketosis part of the repair mechanism? We touched on this before, but just to fully clarify here, while we're healing, is there something inherently healing about being ketosis of those broken mitochondria?
Like I said, I think that the biggest mechanism is just the reduction in, like, letting your cells turn over and get reintegrated with new fatty acids. I think that's the biggest thing. But again, just like looking at our normal human physiology over a long period of time, we would have had times, every human would have had times going through periods of ketosis seasonally, in times of food scarcity, fasting. There's so many reasons and mechanisms why. And so do I think it's normal for people to be eating 400 grams of carbs every day indefinitely? Absolutely not. And so I'm sure someone like Lat Mansour, I don't know if you've had him on the podcast, he'd be able to tell you of, like, specifically the ketones from a signaling molecule. Like, I think that there's a lot that probably makes sense there, or like how it could be helpful. As far as like direct mechanisms or studies or anything like that, like I'm not sure exactly if there's anything relating to, again, this like seed oil depletion and linoleic acid depletion in the cells and repairing the mitochondria. But it does, I think it's just like same thing with, I think, elimination diets, fasting, and people with gut dysfunction, removing fiber and going on a carnivore diet when you have something like Crohn's can be very, very helpful to effectively just give the body a break and the gut a break. And you just let it heal itself. And then you can start adding things on after that. Like, how many times I've heard of people who have had late stage Crohn's, like very intense bowel issues, going on a strict carnivore diet, and then able to incorporate plant foods and fibers back into the diet. Whereas any amount of fiber in the past would have absolutely ruined them. But, call it 2, 3, 6 months, a year, 2 years on a carnivore diet, because the meat just, you digest it a little bit earlier in your digestion. So you basically just get the large colon at a rest. And I think the same thing can be said around ketogenic diet and this flywheel of creating electrons in the mitochondria. Like when you're going through that for a long period of time, you're, again, just like, you're letting that cycle do its thing, change over, and not overburdening it with tons of carbohydrates. When you're trying to Like if I broke my arm and I go do any activity and don't let it heal, it's not going to heal. And that's just something like seems very obvious. And why wouldn't that same sort of thought happen on a micro level? It happens on a macro level. Why wouldn't it happen on a micro level? So I think that there's like just a period of rest sometimes that's needed to not overburden the system.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
Eating an ultra processed food diet, especially full of seed oils for a long period of time, really can mess up physiology. It basically changes the mitochondria in a way that you cannot effectively use carbohydrates. That is then confused with carbs are bad inherently.